Okay, so tonight, we're here to learn more about the history about the Monterey Peninsula. And Mr. John Sanders, who authored the book, An Illustrated Introduction to Historic Hotel del Monte, I hope I got that all right, and it is a beautiful book. He's also writing a second one that will be coming out soon. He's going to give us and share insights on the historic Hotel del Monte and 17 Mile Drive. And that's been a pretty important part of our history. Things that he's going to talk about was who was the architect of the original 17 Mile Drive? What did it take to build the world's most elegant seaside resort in 120 days during a year that had rains and flooding rains? Why did they wait 2 decades before they adopted the name 17 Mile Drive? Those are some things he's going to cover. I have a military card that lets me get into the hotel grounds. And if you've never seen the hotel, somehow you have to get in there. It is absolutely beautiful. And I'm so glad that it still exists. John's going to fill you in on all kinds of history. There you go, Mr. Saunders.
Thank you, Brett. I appreciate that introduction very much. Hope this is about the right level for the microphone. What a great crowd. Thank you for coming. It's really a pleasure to be here in Carmel and have this opportunity to talk about one of my favorite subjects, the Hotel del Monte. I had the privilege of working there for a little over 3 decades, and during that time, a lot of stories unfolded for me, which was a great surprise. Fred mentioned that it still existed. The image that you see here is a late 1880s illustration, and the main portion of the front of the hotel, that was destroyed in the fire in 1924. So when you go to the Naval Postgraduate School, you won't see this Swiss Gothic architecture, but you will see remnants of it in the east and west wings, and they're really quite remarkable. 65,000 square feet, 66,000 square feet in each of the buildings, just to give you an idea of scale. When we did a renovation one year and historic restoration, the architect of the Capitol, Dr. Alan Huntman, I had a chance to spend several hours with Dr. Huntman walking around and being able to discuss the hotel. So I had not only the daily experience, but the opportunity to work with a number of distinguished visitors. When Alberto Gonzalez was the Attorney General, he came with his family, his children, his mother-in-law, and they all were interested in the hotel history. So the Admiral had me take them around, and it was a couple hours with the Attorney General and his wife and mother-in-law and a couple of kids. It was great fun. But thank you for inviting me. Nancy, thank you so much for your communication and coordination. I really appreciate it. It's great to see some old friends and colleagues in the audience here tonight. Nancy is going to be advancing the graphics for me, so from time to time I'll be giving her some cues so that we can proceed. And so Nancy, we're going to start with the first slide. In Monterey, a town of fables and tales with its blend of worlds old and new, its patchwork collection of dusty trails and dry gulches, its modest buildings cobbled together, bracing one another against the sea wind. Charles Crocker found an ideal setting for the world's most elegant seaside resort. Monterey would forever change. There is a remarkable demarcation line from the late 1870s to the arrival of Hotel Del Monte and its grand opening in 1880. And some of that transformation, was captured by Jules Tavernier, the person who did this sketch. It was published in the Argonaut in 1878. The sketch captures Lower Alvarado Street, where Tavernier built a studio in 1875, becoming the first resident artist of Monterey. If you were on Alvarado Street today and going across Del Monte from the conference center to Starbucks, you're basically crossing the area in the area where the Bohemia Saloon and Tavernier's studio existed. I kind of think that the Starbucks is where the studio was. It's just a guess on my part. But my storyline for my current book, Dawn of the 17-Mile Drive, begins with Tavernier. And I will, during the course of the evening, read a few passages from that current book. I haven't finished it. I'm not that close to finishing it. I probably have about 15,000 words, but I still have quite a bit more to cover in just the early years. So, Nancy, if you'll... We twisted along through the night, drinking in the fog and reclining in the lee scuppers at every relentless roll. 10 o'clock found us cruising about somewhere in the vicinity of Monterey, peering about in the gray mist for a wharf light and blowing the whistle for some answering sound. It came in the shape of a pistol shot and 100 yells from as many small boys with yellow dog accompaniment. Then a light broke through the blinding bank. The nose of the boat jumped responsive to the quickly turned helm. Figures became outlined against the deepened background. The lines were cast, and Jules Tavernier, a resident Bohemian from the planks high above, fairly held out a welcome. Fred M. Summers, editor, The Argonaut, October 1st, 1878. Summers was on that steamship with some colleagues, Charles Warren Stoddard, Joe Strong, and they spent a few days with Tavernier and fellow artist Carl von Perben on that particular trip. So 1878, a little perspective of the time from a person who came just a year later. Nancy, if you'll proceed on, Robert Louis Stevenson, who arrived in Monterey in September 1879. And in his essay, The Old Pacific Capital, Stevenson chronicled some of the conditions that he saw in Monterey. So Nancy, if you'll have a short video. Stevenson arrived on a small locally owned railroad, the Monterey Salinas Valley Railroad, and he departed on that same railroad in mid-December 1879. Before he departed, work had already begun for a new railroad, a high-speed railroad, under the auspices of the Central Pacific Railroad and Charles Crocker. And kind of a timeline here. Late September, men of material began to arrive around Castroville, and as the rail line proceeded toward Monterey, the land for Hotel Del Monte was purchased, and I'll comment on that in just a bit. Title recorded in January, late January, as logistical supplies arrived for a hotel. Construction began, and the Hotel Del Monte opened on June the 3rd, grand opening on June the 3rd. That's the 120 days roughly for the construction. Now, please understand, Del Monte wasn't complete on June the 3rd, 1880, but the progress was quite striking. And so, how did Monterey change in those 120 days? Nancy, if you'll proceed, this is from the book. A fairy castle has just risen, observed Josephine Clifford, one of the hundreds from San Francisco who stayed at Del Monte in its opening weeks. High-speed trains bound for the hotel skirted San Francisco Bay as they departed the city, then hurtled past orchards and farms in the Santa Clara Valley before crossing the Salinas River south of the railroad's new Castroville Junction. A few miles of tall sand dunes followed before reaching Del Monte's towering pine forest. The hotel is invisible from the road, but flags floating from mansard domes and pinnacles showed themselves above the forest of trees that surround it, observed a member of the Grand Army of the Republic as he arrived with more than 1,000 wartime veterans on a July excursion. Del Monte guests were greeted by carriages at the depot, the drivers holding the reins of finely groomed horses. From the depot, the steeds trotted through the native pine grove past Laguna del Rey, Lake of the Kings, and into the Botanical Park. A turn in the Macadam Road revealed the first view of the castle, its Swiss Gothic towers soaring high above the forest canopy, a grand 38-star American flag waving atop the central spire. Boldly patterned, vibrantly colored flower beds added to the allure. At night, with its 1,001 gas jets flashing out of its many windows, it looks more like the fairy palace dreamed of in our childhood than like a modern caravansary. As I read these sections from the book, please note I can't take time to tell you what is in quotation marks. Sometimes I'll identify the source, but I use contemporary writings from individuals, news media, other sources like that for some of this material. So if it sounds like it's coming from that time period, and I hope it does, that is my intent. Nancy, if you'll go to the next slide. So what did it take to build a Victorian-era theme park beside the ancient Pueblo of Monterey in 120 days? And I want to make that kind of distinction. For years, I referred to it as Hotel Del Monte, as a resort. And the deeper I dug into this history, the more I see it as a pioneering theme park. The 17-mile drive was an important part of that theme park. Crocker's Transcontinental Railroad had helped usher in an age of progress in the 19th century America, but time had stood still in the Pueblo of Monterey. There was no public infrastructure, there were no municipal facilities, oil lanterns provided light at night, water came from wells. So, what did it take to build a Victorian theme park in 120 days? Consider three elements: imagination, ingenuity, and logistics. And Nancy, if you will just go on, we'll take the first one. If you'll go to the next, imagination. And go to the next one. We'll begin with the imagination of Jules Tavernier, because Tavernier was commissioned to create Hotel Del Monte's first marketing art. You can see this in Terry Trotter's gallery in Pacific Grove. From the book, a sketch of the Hotel Del Monte has just been executed by the artist Jules Tavernier to the order of one of its owners, a magnate of the Central Pacific Railroad, noted one Southern California paper. Another editor called Tavernier's sketch of the hotel elegant, with surrounding objects of interest, both real and fanciful, all on one card. Tavernier's rendering, both real and fanciful, portrayed the varied attractions of Hotel Del Monte in 7 panels. At the center was a bird's eye view of the hotel, with carriages along the hotel's concourse. Smaller border panels surrounded the hotel, depicting guests promenading along the beach by the Del Monte bathhouse, children playing, a group on the shore of Cypress Point, pilgrims and sightseers going to the Carmel Mission ruins, and a solitary hiker standing along the granite cliffs of Point Lobos, his arms outstretched as if in a moment of reverie. Tavernier's rendering portrayed this coming theme park weeks before construction of the hotel was completed. In fact, the bathhouse initially was not completed as it's shown in Tavernier's rendering, but by November it had been. So Tavernier had access to the plans in some regard. The scene of Point Lobos, I kind of pictured this as his self-expression, because some of his most famous paintings from our area capture scenes at Point Lobos. But Nancy, go to the next slide. Imagination comes in the development of an idea, a winter resort in California. From this ad, this is an ad from 1881, a winter resort, that had never been done. Okay? And there were a lot of naysayers along the way. And at the same time that Crocker is building this theme park, he is building a second transcontinental railroad. It's a southern route going to New Orleans. So imagination in the pursuit of major projects, the second transcontinental line, and I touch on it in the book. Frank Pixley, co-founder of the Argonaut with Fred Summers, traveled the road from San Francisco to Tucson in April, where he attended a banquet to mark the railroad's progress. Orator Tom Fitch, the keynote speaker for the evening, remarked, "It was a bold and audacious undertaking for Messrs. Stanford and Crocker and their associates to undertake to lay the rails from the Bay of San Francisco to the Gulf of Mexico. I have the personal assurance of both Governor Stanford and Mr. Charles Crocker that it will reach to San Antonio in Texas in less than 2 years." Fitch added, "I have seen the road as it is being pushed by its energetic builder, Mr. Strobridge. I have seen a way out on the mesa beyond Tucson, 1,000 miles from San Francisco, acres of ties and miles of rails. I saw the graders ahead of the track layers and the engineers ahead of the graders, hundreds of men at work, heading eastward with energy, enthusiasm, and money. Crocker and Stanford's first transcontinental railroad had opened commerce between California, the Midwest, and the North Atlantic. A route south to the Gulf of Mexico could move goods and people faster to major European ports and create new opportunities for world trade and travel. Hotel Del Monte would become the queen of the transcontinental railroad lines, and set beside scenic Monterey, would rule as the pioneering Pacific Coast destination for American tourists and adventurous globetrotters. The Queen of American Watering Places is one of the subtitles that Major Benjamin C. Truman developed during his time as the chief of the literary department, the Southern Pacific Company's literary department. And that was the group that was producing stories and advertising and illustrations for the larger company and for the hotel. Ben Truman, by the way, he had been he was a Civil War veteran, so very influential in the Grand Army of the Republic. And when President Lincoln was assassinated, Andrew Johnson summoned him to the White House to serve as his personal secretary. He served in that role for about 18 months before he was given positions abroad, especially, and as the paymaster of the Army, but he also became an ambassador. Ben Truman, I'll mention, refer to him from time to time. The next slide. Ingenuity. Ingenuity comes in technological innovation, especially engineering expertise, advanced technologies, adapting advanced technologies, and creating new guest conveniences. Bathrooms, gas lighting, waterworks, steam heating, gas power plant, plumbing system, clubhouse, bathhouse, racetrack, botanical park, telephone network, high-speed railroad. And these were all part of Crocker's development at Monterey. There were 55 cities in the United States that had telephone networks in 1880. Guests could come to Del Monte, and there on the front desk was a telephone. I mean, it didn't connect to the rest of the United States, but it was a novelty of the times that could be used to get carriages and horses ready from the stables. To the next one, Nancy. Ingenuity in shaping an idea, creating a new construct for place, even in the face of obstacles and public criticism. And Crocker and Stanford received a fair amount of criticism during this time. I'll just note from this advertisement, famous summer and winter resort, and this is midwinter views. Look at the way that the artist's work has been developed to convey this lush location. Picture yourself in a blizzard in New York in February, and you've got a chance to travel the rails to Del Monte. This is the idea. But the criticism, for example, from the book. The little Spanish-Mexican town of Monterey, after a sleepy hollow repose of half a century, is to be awakened, wrote the Santa Cruz Weekly Sentinel. The demand for reapers in Monterey is without parallel in history. They are being bought and hired by Stanford and Company to fan the fog out of the road leading from Hotel Del Monte. To see Monterey is, in our humble opinion, to see very little of a much talked of thing. It seems to have fallen asleep some 50 years ago, calmly awaiting Gabriel and his trumpet to move them, remarked the Oakland Tribune. Letter writers also resorted to hyperbole. I see by the papers that they are going to build a large hotel and start a rival watering place, commented Santa Cruz resident Martha Wilson. They may expend money by the billions, but they can't shut out cold, bleak northwest trade winds, nor can money disperse the fogs that frequently hang over the old capital. As well might Mr. Edison attempt to get up artificial sunlight at midnight with his electric light, as for millionaires to attempt to make Monterey the rival of Santa Cruz. Eminent California Supreme Court Justice William P. Lawler characterized the Times. They used to call that place Crocker's Folly. Go to the next one. Ingenuity in creating a sense of place. This taking a blank page and shaping and molding an idea, something new. Next one. Integrating recreation, sports, and playfulness into the fabric of life. Hold on, Nancy, don't go too fast. Because I want to highlight this detail section. Here's the location of Hotel Del Monte. You've driven by it on Highway 1 as you go past the Naval Postgraduate School. You can see the radars and satellite dishes on top of the 5-story Spanicle Hall that's near the highway. And in fact, what's listed here is Castroville Road. That basically is the roadbed where Highway 1 now proceeds. But this section, notice that there are two elements. Bathhouse, just a short distance away on the white sand beach, and the racetrack in the opposite direction. Two important recreational diversions. There were other elements built into this. Trap shooting, for example, shooting ranges at the racetrack where it was easy to do. But this is the main portion. Now, playfulness. We see that playfulness in Charles Crocker himself. History books would make him completely stuffy and perhaps arrogant. But this is Charles Crocker. Independence Day, 1880. Just before this group photograph was taken, he led 500 people on a bunny hop. 500. And so, with family and friends largely, he posed for this photo of the bunny hop at that time. Next, Nancy. That's in Terry Trotter's gallery, Pacific Grove. Next. Okay, this article. I wanted to show you this article in its entirety. I'm going to read just a little bit from it. This is from 1883. And you can hit one more time and it'll give the date for it. There was a novel picnic at Monterey on Sunday. It was held on the bathers' raft in the bay, 200 or 300 feet from land. 11 o'clock was the hour of starting. The bay was calm, the air balmy, the spectators numerous, the church bells silent, and the picnickers enthusiastic. Clad in their bathing suits at the word of their leader, Mr. Crocker, they started in a long, varicolored, brilliant, wavering line, which in a few seconds, as deep water was reached, lost its continuity and spotted the space between the shore and raft with heads gray and black and fair and bald and red and flaxen. And among the heads the spectators saw bottles and baskets. And upon the head of Mr. Crocker, a monstrous cake, 3 feet in diameter. Now, I'm not making this up. This is in the news. In the Santa Cruz Sentinel, which was highly critical. Next slide. Logistics. Go ahead to the next slide. I want you to see a couple of the sources, news sources from the day. Here, the San Jose Herald at the end of January 1880. And you can see that they're reporting on the movement of some of the supplies, construction supplies going to Del Monte. This one from the rival San Jose Mercury News, a little bit later in April. April 23rd was the publication date. The railroad bridge across the Salinas River between Castroville and Monterey on the Monterey branch of the Southern Pacific went down with the flood at 3 o'clock yesterday morning. County bridge across the Salinas River following succumbed to the resistless force of the flood at 10 o'clock yesterday morning. There is now no communication with Monterey and cannot be until the river partly subsides. You're building this grand hotel, and your main access route for material is totally wiped out. So, quick rebuild, and it's still amazing that in 120 days. There are some steps that, of course, the construction crew had to take, building hods to cover the plaster so that they could carry the plaster inside and keep it dry in the process. These are kind of details that I lay out a little bit in the book, not really for tonight. But the setting. Next slide, Nancy. This is, go ahead, go on. This is from an 1888 survey. It's the earliest survey that I could find of the property. So what you see is a larger Hotel Del Monte, because there had been a fire in 87 that destroyed it completely. And on the rebuild, it was made even larger and grander in scale and scope. Hit it once, Nancy. This red line gives you a dividing line between the support side, the physical plant of the house, and the recreational side of the house. Try this one more time, Nancy. This gives you a sense of scale. This is a later photograph, a little over 100 people. And Nancy, if you'll hit it one more time. I think they're right here on this portion of the road. That's the angle that you see with the hotel in the background. One more time, Nancy. You'll see an important piece of the property, the clubhouse. That's billiards and bowling alley and card tables and a bar, and mostly for men, but some adventurous Victorian women did make their way into the clubhouse. They did have billiards and a bowling section for the ladies in the hotel, but this was a lot more fun. Tennis courts, other recreational facilities, and in between, you'll notice some specialized gardens. And one more time, Nancy, the blue line shows you the route from the depot leading into the arrival at the Port Cochere for those guests coming to Hotel Del Monte. So the guests had a chance to see part of the grounds. Hold it right there, Nancy. I'm going to read just a little bit from the book. Men of material assembled in the Tombs Grove in late January, and in an enterprise pushed forward with indomitable determination, went immediately to work to create Crocker's fairy tale setting. The foundation of the new hotel at Monterey is about to be laid, and 600,000 brick have just been shipped for the purpose, reported San Jose's Herald. 8 carloads of dressed lumber passed down from Oakland on Wednesday, the paper also noted. Raw material arrived from north and south, iron pipe for the artesian well and hot and cold water plumbing throughout the hotel, equipment for the gas power plant, steam heating, gas lights, and a telephone network, supplies to manufacture spring beds and hair mattresses on site, granite for the macadam roads, garden paths, and racetrack. Unlimited means, skilled labor, trained intelligence, and thorough discipline provided a magnificent illustration of what capital and enterprise together can effect, Truman declared. That was Major Benjamin C. Truman. So next slide, next. So who was the architect of the original 17-mile drive? I mentioned that this was a key part of the Victorian theme park. And for that, I'm just going to draw from my small introductory book, an illustrated introduction to historic Hotel Del Monte. It's only 28 pages. It has a little over 30 illustrations in it, and even a little bit of a storyline. But I concluded with an end note because I wanted to bring something to the fore that I hadn't seen in any other sources, none of the historical documents that I read, reviewed, encountered. History books say that Charles Crocker bought the land for Hotel Del Monte from David Jacks for $5 an acre. Although he acquired thousands of acres from Jacks for his visionary Victorian-era resort, the site for the hotel was purchased in a hotly contested sheriff's sale for $46 per acre. The winning bid by R.P. Hammond Sr. for the native oak and Monterey pine woodland with a white sand beach was a single dollar higher than his fiercest competitors, the executors of the A.G. Toombs estate. Toombs, an enterprising American carpenter who arrived in Monterey when it was still a Mexican pueblo, built several government buildings in the town before the U.S.-Mexico War. He was a wealthy merchant and landowner in Tehama by the time of his death in 1873. Hammond was a soldier and a scholar, an innovative West Point engineer, sharpshooter, and gallant Mexican War hero with extensive experience in surveying, road building, land and mining development, and shipping and railroad operations. He was a leader in the California legislature during early years of statehood, on the first board of regents for the University of California, and a member of West Point's Board of Visitors. He was a police commissioner, port customs collector, a railroad president, and the executive in charge of Crocker's Hotel Del Monte resort development. Evidence points to Hammond as designer and builder of the finely engineered macadam highway that provided the ultimate experience for the American presidents and world leaders who sojourned cross-country by rail and took lengthy carriage or equestrian excursions along Hammond's Road, billed by the Del Monte as the grandest drive on the continent. Stretching from Hotel Del Monte to the scenic granite shores and native Monterey cypress forest and Crocker's 7,000-acre Hotel Del Monte Park Reservation, Hammond's Macadam Road is the original 17-mile drive. And I fleshed that out just a bit. If you'll go to the next slide, and I say it's the original 17-mile drive. I need to offer a little bit of detail here because Charles Crocker does not seem to have used the name for any of the scenic drives. Their advertising was 25 miles of finely macadamized roadway, 7,000 acres, beautiful forest. These different drives were offered. With the drive to Cypress Point, the principal scenic excursion for the theme park. And Major Truman, who was in charge of the literary department, he gave vivid descriptions of the drive to Cypress Point, but he never gave it a name. In fact, his distances varied from 18 to 20 miles. So, anyway, Hammond, just by coincidence, Hammond was born in Hagerstown, Maryland, 3 years after the first macadam road was built in the United States. By the time he attended West Point in the late 1830s, West Point being the first engineering school in America, the Army was teaching how to build macadam roads. Hammond was the only person with the knowledge, experience, and skills to be able to build this finely macadamized road that they would advertise as the grandest drive on the continent. And go to the next slide. And it was important. It was important because if you were in a group going out to Cypress Point in a carriage, you would not want to be in the trailing carriages. If dust was kicking up, floating through, it just would totally mar the experience. But this was a dust-free road. That was the amazing innovation in 1880. Now, next slide. But why did it take 2 decades? And it took nearly 2 decades before the hotel began to use the 17-mile drive name. Others used it as early as 1881. The Los Angeles Herald called it the 17-mile drive. And several others did, but they also had different names as well. They had different distances, 14, 17, 18, 19, and 20. And this went on actually into the 20th century. I think there are some reasons, but I'm running short on time, so I just want to point out the earliest reference that I can really find to a name for the drive comes in photographs that Carlton Watkins did for the Southern Pacific Company to exhibit in the New Orleans World's Fair in 1884. And so this is the earliest that you see a name that's somehow connected to the hotel. It's also the earliest that you see the name of a tree being given a name. Now, this obviously is not the lone cypress that you're accustomed to. This tree was renamed multiple times, and in its last iteration, it was known as the witch tree. Next slide. But a few years later, artist Julian Ricks did a painting that was converted into a photogravure and used by publisher Jay Dewing and editor John Muir for Picturesque California, really a landmark book. And here Ricks used Lone Cypress, Midway Point, 18-mile drive. Now for many years, even up to the 1930s, that was referred to as the Midway Point. Next slide. The actual first use that I can pinpoint by the hotel for a specific name for the drive is 1889 in a souvenir guest book. And there they called it the 18-mile drive. The guest book was written by Will C. Moore, who had replaced Truman as the chief of the literary department for the Southern Pacific. Will Moore was better known as a short story writer for his works of horror, and the macabre. And this is how he described an 18-mile drive. Skirting its pine-clad peninsula domain of 7,000 acres, the Pacific Improvement Company has constructed the finely macadamized road known as the 18-mile drive. Little is said when it is asserted that this is the grandest drive on the continent. Let us traverse it and note some of the strange and striking scenes which it discloses. I drove part of it on my way here. He goes on, between Pebble Beach and Cypress Point, there's a stretch of wild rocky coast with frowning promontories and wave-worn caverns, bleak spray-dashed rocks jutting naked from the land, and black reefs at their base. The bluffs are crowned with those strange trees called cypresses, which cling to the rocks with fierce tenacity, sprawling, clinging, grasping, seemingly with desperate strength, the immovable crags which give them support. Nowhere else in the world is this species seen. Like their neighbors, the pines, they belong to this locality. They're restricted to it. What inscrutable mystery of nature lies hidden in this singular phenomenon? Why should this spot, of all others in the world, have been selected as the home of this grotesque freak of nature? Okay. I just want to do two more quick things to wrap this up. One is a video that's my impression of Del Monte in the early years, and you may have to hear this twice. Go to the next, yes, the prologue to the book, which, as I said, is still in progress. The 17-mile drive in California rests upon an ancient bed of granite along the southern shore of Monterey Bay. Cypresses grow among the boulders here, angular, accentuated, and artfully green by the sea. The regal cypress blends with stone mist in an endless dance of shadow and light. Nearby are the tide pools of the Solomar and the Esteros of Monterey. To the north are the sloughs of Moss Landing in Watsonville and the chalk cliffs of Santa Cruz. South are the Santa Lucia Mountains with seacoasts of serpentine, jasper, and jade. Inland, along the Salinas River, lie the Gabbla Mountains in the valley of Steinbeck. Above the rocky shore of Pacific Grove stands the lighthouse, an early building of the American period. In Monterey are the adobes of Spanish and Mexican days, the canneries that once brimmed with sardines, and a fading trace of Hotel Del Monte, where the 17-mile drive first gained world fame. Thank you.
Questions?
Is there access to a docent-led tour of the hotel property on a scheduled basis?
You want to repeat the question, please?
The question, is there a docent-led tour of the hotel property now owned by the Navy. And to my knowledge, there is not. When before 9/11, we had events which I helped to organize and would provide tours during those public programs. But security postures have changed markedly, and so I'm not aware of any specific events. Can you hold just one moment? I'll come to you next. Let me just note too that invariably when I have a chance to meet with a group like yours, I always learn something from the audience. So please feel free to offer your input too as well if you've got a nugget of history about the hotel. And yes, sir, you had a question.
Yes, I have two. At its zenith, how many rooms, how large of a hotel was that? And secondly, is why 120 days? What was the necessity to do that in 120 days? It almost seems unbelievable that could be happening.
True. Great question. And what I will tell you is that Major R.P. Hammond Sr., West Point graduate, executive in charge of resort development, had several friends, classmates from his West Point days, including the person who in 1880 was the commanding general of the United States Army, William Tecumseh Sherman. And by September, President Rutherford B. Hayes, his family, General Sherman, his daughter Rachel, and several others are at Del Monte by September of 1880. So Hayes did not run for re-election. So to get the President of the United States, the sitting President of the United States, and by the way, Hayes was the first American president to cross the Rockies, summit the Sierras, and come to California. This was huge, and I really go into some detail in the book because it's significant, in my opinion.
John, he asked about the quantity of rooms. How large was it?
So initially, the hotel would have been basically built along this line, okay? About 100 rooms at that point in 1880. However, with the success, the completion of the Second Transcontinental Railroad to New Orleans, and the success that the Del Monte had, Crawford built a wing on the western side in 1883. Fire destroyed the hotel entirely in 1887. So he dusted off the blueprints, brought back the main building, took the idea of the wing on the west side, and it expanded it, enlarged on it, and built a similar one on the eastern side as well. So about 450 guest rooms by the time they finished and reopened in late 1887. Yes.
Maybe a trivial question, but and maybe it's going to keep us in suspense. But how do we get from 18-mile drive to the 17-mile drive? Officially the 18-mile drive. Now it's officially the 17-mile drive.
So I cannot explain that.
That's a good question from the audience.
Yeah. The hotel had souvenir guest books, the 1889 guest book. 1897, they published this beautiful, elaborate, 72-page, 4-color guest book. Unbelievable, richly illustrated. And They just used the name 17 Mile Drive. But they were still advertising 18 Mile Drive. As late as the visit of President William McKinley in 1901, they're still using 18 Mile Drive along with 17 Mile Drive. And even this incredible group of hotel men came for a visit. Hotel men you'd think would be totally in the know, right? They're this was a large train of top hotel men from the East. They wrote a book about their travels, and they called it the 19 Mile. I cannot explain it. I just.
You think it has anything to do with the Bohemian Saloon?
How are the pros?
Interesting thought. The Bohemian Saloon went through some significant changes in the latter part of the 19th century. So I don't believe there's any connection there, but you never can be sure in the records that are available how certain customs emerge, because there's no documentation. You have to kind of piece through available clues and do your best. So in part, I can tell you that the 18-mile drive, well, let me back up. Ben Truman, when he described the drive to Cypress Point, he said there are two routes. One, you take the road to the right. The other, you take the road to the left. and so this is Monterey, 1880, right? So Truman liked the road to the right. However, that took you by the custom house and the whaling station and whale rendering, and then by the squid drying racks. And so the sensory experience and at the outset, and by the way, guests could rent carriages and teams, take their own time and go out. And so that's why Truman likely said road to the right, road to the left. There were only those two options. But there was that smell. So when Morrow called it an 18-mile drive, he took the road to the left. It comes up the hill, Abrego and Munro Street, that's the road to the left. And you come up and crest the ridge, and then you come down Carpenter, and that's part of the road, I believe, that was the early start of the 18-mile. Yes, sir.
I have something I want to give you.
Oh, can you hold off? Question? Oh, yes.
The Navy bought it around 1950 or something like that. What shape was it in when they purchased it?
Okay. The Navy used the hotel on an emergency basis in World War II. This was when Pearl Harbor was attacked. The United States military had a force strength of about 350,000. That is all services at the time. The mobilization brought in, I believe, 17 million. So the training facilities that you had for a standing operating force of 350,000, totally overwhelmed. For the Navy's part, it requisitioned 100 hotels around the country. It established agreements with dozens of universities. And so the Navy initially was there on an emergency basis. And it gets into a whole nother vein about the subsequent transition, but there was a years-long debate about the purchase. So it was 1947 when Congress appropriated the money, and actually 1948 when the Del Monte Properties Company, the forerunner of the Pebble Beach Company, received the check. Yes, sir.
When did Morris buy it from Proctor?
If you look at the logo for today's Pebble Beach Company, you'll see the silhouette of the lone cypress, and you'll see 1919 engraved underneath it. And that was the year that Morse was able to get the financial backing and establish Del Monte Properties Company. Yes, sir.
You haven't mentioned the golf course that was added in 1897, I think, at Del Monte.
Yeah, I didn't go that far out. I stayed primarily in just the first few years.
Is there anything you could say about that and how significant that might have been into as far as the success of the hotel and also the future development of what became
I can't honestly summarize that crisply, but Neil Hoteling has written quite well about the golf course and its significance and its role. So I refer you to Neil's work.
Two questions. One is, where is there a copy of that four-color guest book?
The Naval Postgraduate School Archives has a copy. I believe that if you go to the website, and Nancy had provided the link for that website, that they have done a great job, actually, of posting a lot of digital content online, but you can't find it just using the regular kind of web tools. Go to Google Scholar, and you can access it. I had worked with Stanford, and Stanford had actually digitized it originally and done a wonderful job for us. And so they could have a digital copy. And I'm pretty sure that Irene Berry at the Naval Postgraduate School has posted that digital copy online.
And as remarkable as it was that they built the original 120 days after it burned, it was equally remarkable how they rebuilt it. I forget, it was an unbelievable time frame.
Some of the numbers are stunning, very stunning. Yes, sir.
Is there a rumor that there was a haunting in one of the rooms there?
So, in federal service, some of you may be familiar, you have a position description, and it outlines your roles and responsibilities. And then there's this fine print at the end that says other duties as assigned. So I actually, an admiral actually assigned me this history stuff in the show, and I just grew to really embrace it. But along the way, when people would have experiences that they couldn't explain, they get directed toward me. So an FA-18 pilot and his wife came to see me one time, and they had been in the hotel for just a few weeks. He was attending a professional short course, and their first night in the room, about 2 a.m., they said, they were awakened by their young son, their infant son, who was standing up in the crib, holding on to the edge and just kind of jabbering, almost like he's in a conversation. And they went up to the crib, and the pilot, you understand, an F-18 is a pretty damn complex machine. And so you've got to have incredibly fine-tuned senses. He said the temperature on the crib dropped 5 degrees. Now, they laid the boy down. He went back to sleep. The second night, same thing occurred. And same experience. The temperature just tapered down immediately on the crib. Third night, the wife, as she woke up, she said there was a dresser with a mirror in the room, and her eyes went by that mirror, and she said for an instant she saw eyes by the crib, but vanished, immediately. But these were among the credible people that had experiences, and there are several places that I would consider to be hot spots. So, what I did before I retired, I convinced the Navy to start a ghost blog. So if you were ever able to go into the building, there's a registration desk for those people who can stay there. You just ask for the ghost log. I took Brian Edwards, the new Monterey Museum and Library Director, for a walkabout to introduce him to the facility recently. And I asked for the ghost log. And, some were just prank entries, and some were serious.
It had something to do with the woman who passed there in a fire with her husband there when she was on her honeymoon.
There is definitely that story, and Randy Reinstedt actually had a tape recording of a session with that woman. Unfortunately, Randy's health has fallen off, and Debbie does not know what became of that tape.
Thank you for this, appreciate it.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Having grown up here, it was always my understanding and my friends that the 17-mile drive was a Sam Morse, in order to promote Pebble Beach, wanted to get people out there, was promoting the distance and travel between the Del Monte Hotel and the lodge. Have you ever heard anything about this?
Morse came so much later.
Pardon?
Morse came so much later. The drive was a central part of the hotel from the day that it opened. Now, it's interesting, you look at the Pebble Beach website, and they'll say 1881, 17-mile drive was completed. And this is in part because the Rancho properties that David Jacks sold to Crocker, the Pacific Improvement Company, that purchase wasn't completed until 1881. So there's a little, but they didn't use the name 17-mile drive, okay? The road was in use right from the beginning. They completed the Macadam Road after the property was acquired. But by the way, there were issues with the title for that land. There were claims on that land, and those weren't resolved until the 20th century. Any others? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I never knew what a Macadam Road was, so. Thank you so much. Just a quick reminder of some events that are happening. You can meet us at your Carmel Residence Board Directors. next Thursday at the Farmers Market. We'll be there from 10 to 2. Our next no host mix and mingle will be Thursday, November 3rd, and that will be at Edwin's Polynesian Island Restaurant. We also have our holiday gala, which sells out regularly, so you'll want to get the tickets quickly for that. That will be given, information will be given around the 1st of November, and that's at the La Playa Hotel. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and thank you, Mr. Sanders.